Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to this Global AgriFutures Insights webinar. I am your host today, Kylie Horomia. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for AgriTech NZ. And just a bit of housework before we get diving in. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll hope to get to those questions. I've been a little bit brutal on our beautiful host here as she's managed to sort of squeeze down what would originally be a 2 to 3 hour presentation into one. So if we don't get to your questions, we will respond back to you directly after this webinar's finished up. We will also be recording the webinar, so if you need to jump out for any reason, have no fear, you'll be able to watch it to your heart's content over and over again. And on that note, I would like to welcome the wonderful Lucie Douma. So Lucie manages the COVID recovery and supply chain team at the Ministry for Primary Industries. She is also the 2022 Nuffield Scholar, which is the basis for this webinar today. And you know, her background, she grew up on a dairy farm, so a lot of that experience feeds into her career and her opportunities that she's taken on board, including consulting for KPMG, through to MPI, and also the Ministry for the Environment. So thank you very much, Lucie, for being here. I think this was a 5-month plan in the works for this webinar to get going.
Cool. Thanks very much for the introduction, Kylie. And look, it's great to be here with you all. So welcome. Hope you find something interesting from this talk as well. So I'll just go and share my screen. Once I do that, I can't see anybody anymore. So Kylie will just have to let me know when you have questions.
Will do.
So yes, I'm talking to you today about just some of the insights I saw overseas, because I spent roughly 4 months overseas last year, and I've still got a few trips to go this year as well. And so just to preface this, so these are my views. So this is the conversations I've had with people overseas and with some of the other research I've done around this. So they're just my views, not MPI's or anybody else's. So what I wanted to talk to you today, so I'll just set some of the context and explain what Nuffield is, and then I will focus on water challenges in North America, because that's pretty big, and it's impacting us here as well, as we're seeing from some of the weather events and things we're getting at the moment, with too much rain in the north and not enough in the south. We'll then go into some of the labour challenges and some of the solutions that countries are doing there to address some of those labour challenges. Then I'll go into some of the food security side. And then I'll talk to the Corn Belt as well and how that's impacting some of the GMO trends. And then I'll do a bit of a comparison of North America and Europe. Now, again, this is just from the countries I've been to, not the whole continents themselves. So Kylie did a really good introduction, so I don't think I need to spend too much time on this, but I'm Lucie, and yes, I work at MPI, come from a farming background, and I've got a Nuffield scholarship. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a global farming scholarship. So there's about 17 countries involved in it globally, and basically there's 3 scholars in New Zealand and 22, and we each picked a topic of significance in the primary industries. So my specific topic is actually on data interoperability between different systems, only that's what I won't be covering today. I'll do that maybe in a future webinar. But yeah, so as a part of that program, you spend a lot of time overseas talking to those farmers and being in that context and learning from them, and you can learn so much from being out of your own comfort zone, which I'm sure many of you will have seen in your travels abroad as well. So where did I go? So the blue countries is where I've been. So I spent a significant amount of time over here in the UK, Scotland, up to the Shetland Islands even. I was also in Norway and in the Netherlands. I spent quite a bit of time through North America as well, so both the US and Canada, and Australia, and obviously New Zealand. The green countries are those that I'm still going to this year, so that's Singapore, India, can't see this one very well, but that's Qatar, Germany, and the US again, so that will be in June, July. So in the US, because the US and North America in general, pretty large, you can't claim that as one area, and each state is very different. So where I spent most of my time there was in California, Texas, Illinois, Washington, DC and Saskatchewan, with some trips around in some of the other neighbouring states. And so if we move straight into the water side, so water, it's one of our most critical resources when it comes to growing food. So there's two angles to water that I'll talk to. So one is the water access side, so having enough water to grow. And then we've also got the water quality challenges, so making sure our water is of the right quality to grow the crops that we want to. With water, so California is where I'll kind of focus on this, because California is having to deal with some really big challenges at the moment. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with California, they're very big. So their global or their export market is about 85 billion New Zealand dollars for the primary industries, and that's larger than us. We're at 54, 53. So they're a lot bigger than us. Their largest exports, which you probably didn't know, is actually dairy. And there's a number of reasons for that. Their dairy sits mainly in the north here, but also it's barned. So you can get a lot more cows inside than what we have with our free range and, pastoral systems. That's followed closely by grapes and almonds. They have roughly 70,000 farms over the whole state, and New Zealand's roughly 55,000. So here in New Zealand, we farm on 13 million hectares, and in California, they farm on 40 million hectares. So it's about 1.5 times the size of New Zealand. It's the third largest state in the US.
So Lucie, what's the percentage again on how much they provide fresh produce to the rest of the country?
Yeah, so I'll get to that. So they provide about 2/3 of the country's fruit and nuts for the US and 1/3 of America's vegetables. So they're a massive player in the domestic food market there. They don't compare to any of the other states. Where I spent most of my time was actually here in the San Juan Valley. So that's where they do all of their nuts and horticulture produce. And I'd gone up into the Sierra Nevada as well. So really important state for American food and for global food too, because we get a lot of food here in New Zealand as well from California, like table grapes and things.
So it was, sorry, Lucie, so that was table grapes, not wine grapes?
Oh, both.
Both.
Yeah, so grapes is both. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So water. So what happens in the water in California? So they, at the moment, the Sierra Nevada, so actually if I go back to the map, so here, that's their mountain range, and they rely on their water. It comes from snowmelt, most of it, and groundwater. They don't actually get a lot of rainfall in the state, and here closer to the coast, then they get a lot of fog. So fog provides enough precipitation for the plants to grow, but they don't rely on rain like what we do here in New Zealand. So what that means is that in the winter when it snows, this here, the Sierra Nevada, acts like a giant reservoir. And so that slowly melts that water, and then that fills the rivers that the farms can then take from. Now, what we're seeing, though, is with their forest fires, which is significant over there, and they're growing every year, that the snow's not settling as soon as it falls. So it's melting a lot quicker, and they're seeing more rain. So this is a big problem for actually having enough access to water during the growing periods. Now, the other thing you have is that they also are sitting on a floodplain here. So when it does rain, it rains really heavily. And so they need to manage that as well. So they've got a lot of challenges of just the water and how it is formed in California. So with how they manage that with the different farms I spoke to, it's done quite interestingly, because in Clarksburg, which is just south of Sacramento, they have a lot of vineyards there. That's a very old growing region. They actually have no water access restrictions. And so each county within California kind of manages their own water allocations, and they manage it within their own county. So further down counties aren't actually in that equation when they're looking at their own county. So there's quite an individualistic approach that they take. And so that means also that there's quite a lot of land that's actually still flood irrigated. About 40% of the land is still flood irrigated. Now, there is a number of reasons for that. So one of the reasons they do that is it recharges the land. So they take from the river, flood it, and it recharges the land, like the ground table underneath. There's economic reasons for it. So there's some farmers that have estimated that the cost to put irrigation in would be about $400 more per acre, and they just don't have that money right now. There's also one farmer I spoke to, they did it because they had gopher control. So there's also some of the biosecurity risks around it and pests. But yeah, so that flood irrigation though is not a good resource, a way of managing the water, because a lot of that then just evaporates as well. So that's one of the things that they do. Now, not all of the projects there are doing this. So there are some farms and areas that they're trying to put in new projects of how can they make best use of the water, because it's a critical resource and there's less of it falling every year. So they're getting less. They've had 3 years of drought as well. So there's a lot needing to fall into this now. So Terra Nova Ranch was a farm I'd gone to, and they grow 8% of California's organic tomatoes. So they grow about 25 different high value crops across the whole property, but they rely heavily on groundwater. And when the floods come, the farmer there, Don Cameron, he floods his land so that he can recharge his groundwater. Now, what they've also found, though, is that when it floods, most of that water goes straight back into the rivers and out to sea. So what he's done is he's got this King River water project where he's building these canals going through different farming properties that when it floods, they will fill up with water, and then you can take from there as well. So it's basically recapturing your flood water. What he has challenged with, though, is that the farms around him don't always support him. And this goes back to being that individualistic approach. And a lot of the farmers had huge claims against him saying, well, why should we have to buy the water from you? Or why should you be able to go through our farm to put these canals? So he's had almost a decade that he's worked with other farmers in the region to try and get these canals built. But this stuff is becoming more important as they're seeing that the water just isn't falling the same way it used to. If we move to Texas, so Texas has a similar problem as well. They also don't get a lot of rainfall, and they've had significant droughts over the last few years as well. But interestingly enough, I was over at King Ranch, and King Ranch is the largest ranch in the US. They're about 350,000 hectares, and 30,000 of those hectares are used to grow cotton and sorghum. And I mean, the scale is just not comparable to New Zealand. And but what they do is over that land, they do actually rely on the rain for it to grow. And so instead of irrigating and tilling that land when they plant, they do no-till practices. And that means that the moisture stays within the soil rather than coming up and drying out. And that means that they have these really good environmental practices, and it's purely because they're trying to save the little water that they have and keep it as that precious resource. So water quality is the other aspect to when we're talking about water in general. And this is it's gained a lot of prominence, the water quality challenges, as we've seen here in New Zealand as well. And so I spent quite a bit of time here in Illinois and Saskatchewan up here. And this river line here, that is the Mississippi River. And it has been proven that the pesticide use here in Illinois, which is part of the Corn Belt that I'll go into later, that there is actually contributing to the dead zone in Mexico. Now, that dead zone is basically a whole area where there's just algae bloom growing, and it's taking out all of the oxygen from the sea there. So there's nothing growing underneath. There's no plant life. There's no animals there. And that area is about 20,000 square kilometres in size and growing. So that's the size of the Wairarapa when you compare it to anything in New Zealand. So it's a huge dead zone, and we don't want that. So what is now being done is there's a lot of regulations starting to come onto these farms up here that are contributing towards that, but also further north in Canada. Only a lot of those fertilizer restrictions that are being put on, the governments don't always know what is actually contributing to the water quality challenges here. So they're putting restrictions in without actually fully understanding where that fertilizer is going.
Right. So I think, so Lucie, I think you and I talked about this the other day in terms of cause and effect, right? So yeah, a policy or a regulation with good meaning can come in, but the downside to that is either, a drop in your yield or higher pest or pathogen. So is the restrictions the only thing that they're currently looking at, do you know, or are they looking at alternatives to them? Or, I mean, do they know? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a really good question. not alternatives to pesticides, because you do need them. I mean, you've got organic, but I mean, I was over in Canada and I saw a wheat field that was used with, your chemical recipe alongside it. And then right next to it was a paddock that was, I think it was canola, and that was organically grown. Now, the yield on that, there was next to nothing in that paddock. And actually what that was doing was, with the organic farm, because they weren't putting any pesticides on, it meant that the neighbouring property actually had to put more on, because the one with the organic side, they had a lot of pests there that would actually go back onto the other farms that didn't. And so they actually had a higher usage because of the organic farm next to them.
Right.
Yeah.
So the overall crop loss or a drop in yield for both farms, regardless of yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So what does this all mean? So what is the future of water then, and what's being grown in some of these areas? Because as we talked about earlier, the California is a massive grower of food. It's the food bowl for America. So 2/3 of the nuts and crops, and a third of all the vegetables. That can't be easily replaced by another state. So without water, a lot of the farms there, they're fallowing more of their land, which means there's just nothing being grown on there. And the question is, can we make up some of that deficit or help them come up with technologies that they don't need to be doing that? One case study was actually Stuart Wolf. So he also has a property that's 25,000 acres, and that was originally tomatoes and tomato paste, and now he's moved that into high value crops, so more in the almond space. But he's actually starting to see there's a lot of water restrictions and access problems. So what he's doing is he's actually moving to non-food crops. So these are crops that are for carbon sequestration, which they don't currently get any value from, or financial value, but he expects that will come in future, and solar energy. So this is the big change that's happening over in California, where a lot of farms are actually moving to non-food crops, right, and non-food land use changes.
So obviously those solar panels are quite tasty when you add a bit of salt and pepper on top of them, and for all of us to eat. And I absolutely understand why and the desire to shift, but it comes back to that cause and effect, right? We did have a question here around the cotton field and wheat fields. They're a massive monocrop expanse. If they were growing trees as well, if there were trees, would they not attract atmospheric water and help with that water cycle?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm not a water hydrologist, so I wouldn't actually know the answer to that. But that's a really good question. And you're right, it is huge amounts of monoculture there, because in Illinois as well, the whole state, it's just, it's canola and, no, sorry, not canola, soybeans and corn. That's it. Everywhere you look, just corn and soybeans. So they do need to do a bit more in land use diversification, whether that goes into solar energy, but also trees and things like that, right? And
here's our thoughts anyway.
So Stuart Wolf, so basically he thinks that by in the next few years, he'll actually stop growing on 30 to 40% of his land. And he is a significant grower over there. Right. So if this is happening across scale, I mean, I've read some of the figures that they have reported over there, is that they expect that in the next few years, that 1/10 of the land in California won't be used for farming anymore and for food crops. So that's it's more than 500,000 acres that they think won't be used for food anymore. And that's by 2040. So it's not that far away anymore.
No, and it'd be interesting to see if they run the numbers on what that might look like in terms of impact on existing pricing structures for what's left, and for just being able to supply.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there needs to be another way to grow food. And I know there's different, America itself, North America, is going more into vertical farming. So they're trialing more of those sorts of systems to grow food. But this here is it's going out, these sorts of like big, large land-based systems in California. It's not only happening in California. I mean, the Netherlands is the same. I was over there in March last year, and like they already do that, where energy is part of the farming systems. And they have here, you've got one paddock is solar panels, the paddock next to it, you're growing food crops, and same with the wind turbines. They're in between your food crops. Yeah, so it's a global trend. Labour. So if we move over to labour challenges, I mean, we're seeing it here as well, right? Every country that is growing food has access challenges to labour. And so what are some of the solutions for that is what I'll talk to as well. So the examples I'll use is in California and Scotland, the manual labour they have there and how they're addressing that. And then we'll talk to Illinois and Saskatchewan, which is the bigger arable crop land, and the technology that's being employed there. So in California, for those of you who have gone over there, you'll see it's very manually harvested at the moment. So you have big work gangs who harvest the crops when they're ready for harvest. It's actually quite a good role because they have quite a high minimum wage in comparison to New Zealand. So $15 US is about $26, $27 in New Zealand. And they also have lower living costs. So it's a really good employment model for some of the people coming from Mexico because they do rely on Mexican labor. The people we spoke to, so we spent a bit of time at Western Growers, and the large horticulture farms there, they were really proud of the way that they treated their staff. That was actually really important to them. So they have a lot of permanent staff also from Mexico, and they get a lot of benefits. So they get health insurance, they get all sorts of other insurance and annual leave days and everything. So they do look after them. Where it got really interesting, though, is that was their permanent workforce that they saw that. And then one of the GMs of one of these big growing companies, he then turned around and said, yeah, so when they harvest, it goes on trucks, then we ship it down to Mexico, and then it gets processed on a plant just across the border where they pay $2 an hour, and then it goes back into California. So I thought that was a really interesting take, that he didn't see that as part of his workforce. So he saw that very much as, no, but that's not part of us. We employ someone else. We contract that out. Yeah. So just as an aside. So that's happening in Scotland as well. So in Scotland, I saw John Gray from Angus Soft Fruits. So they grow about 20% of all the fresh berries in UK supermarkets. So that's across Tesco, Sainsbury's, those guys. And with Brexit, so he's not the only one, but they have struggled to get access to labour, and good labour for that matter. So they used to rely on a lot of migrant labour from Eastern Europe, but with Brexit, they can't do that anymore, and they have to get local people. And so that's fine. So they will work with the local people. But the challenge is that you've got maybe 10 people that will come to a training session on how to pick strawberries or raspberries. And then 5 of them will show up the next day at 4 in the morning. And then maybe 3 of them will do it 5 days in a row. So there isn't that reliability with some of their workforce domestically. And so that's having huge implications to them, and they're trying to move really quickly to the automatic harvesting. But when it comes to soft fruits and like your table grapes and things like that, that automatic harvesting is really difficult. It's not quite there yet because it needs to be so soft that it doesn't squeeze or damage any of that fruit. It's different when it's being harvested and going into like wine grape bottles and things like that, because it gets a processing right after that, it gets processed. But if it's not processed, then you need to be really careful with that picking technology. So with Western Growers, what they have at the moment, they've got their global harvest automation project. So some of you may have come across this or are working with them even. And that was launched in 21, kind of as a response to California not being able to access that Mexican labor when the borders were shut. And then that was a really big problem where some properties there actually didn't harvest a lot of their crops. It was left on the paddocks because they just could not access that labor. So with that global harvest automation project, what that's doing is they want to harvest, or they want to automatically harvest 50% of the crops in the next 10 years. Now that is a massive undertaking, because if you've seen California, there is not a lot of automation there at the moment. So that program kind of has a 3-pronged approach with Western Growers, and they have that the people who create the mechanical arms here, so they work purely on the mechanical arm movement, right? So they get to focus on that. They are also buying in data and all of the GPS type work from companies that know how to do that. So they're buying that in and providing it to these people that create these models. So it's a partnership. And then the third part to it is they have a lot of growers, because they represent roughly 50 to 60% of all fruit production and vegetables in California, as well as members across Florida and I think there's a couple of other states down in the south, but mainly in California. So they have really strong relationships with those growers, and they can do trials really quickly. So if you've got those three areas where you've got someone working on maximizing the potential of these arms, as well as someone who's providing the data for it to operate, and then you've got the farmers that are willing to test that on their properties. I mean, that's how you get these things at speed, that trifecta relationship.
So Lucie, this is a bit of a shout out really to all the innovators here in New Zealand in terms of one of the things that if you're thinking about what's that next thing that you want to create, we're looking at some harvesters here, but more importantly, collaboration with someone else who can actually, so you're working together on that final project, but you're focused on what you're good at. We did have a question here. Do you think robot harvesting will gain traction in New Zealand?
Well, so I think New Zealand is a really good test market. So we're really good innovators here in New Zealand. Like we can test new things here, and we can trial different automation options here. But I think we need to be in the larger markets where they have the scale. Yeah. So we're just not big enough in New Zealand.
So a couple more questions. That you've obviously hit a really nice hot topic here. Do you think we need to pair automation with more post-harvest resilience in our crops to allow this to happen more quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a nice simple answer.
That's a nice easy yes no answer, and it would be really bad if I said no there.
I'll be saying, and this webinar comes to an end. No. And then just another question related to this. Do you think, so obviously it might have sounded a little bit strange saying there's not a lot of automation in California given its proximity to Silicon Valley. Do you think it's because of cheap labor just across the border that is the reason why?
Yeah, it is. And so they've relied on the cheap labor. I mean, we're doing the same thing with RSE workers here, right? We're no different. We rely on that to grow. And with the automation, I mean, where it really fell apart was COVID. So COVID really showed them how fragile that was and how that access can just be turned off to the migrant labor. So that's where it really pushed them to think, okay, actually, we need automation here and we need it quickly. So how do we do this at speed? And you're right, Kylie, when you talked about it, it goes back to the relationships. So it's about the connections you're making and the other people you're working with, because you cannot do this on your own.
So when you said you said at speed, what speed is Western Growers operating at right now? Like from woe to go, obviously they've got things in trial and that. I mean, how fast have they been moving?
Well, they have ambitious timelines, right? So 50% in the next 10 years, that's by 2030. So they're going to have to move at speed.
But I mean, again,
there's a lot of trials happening at the moment, and they're putting a lot of funding into this, and they're getting the support from their membership base to put the funding into that because they understand the value of it. Right, that's key here as well. They can fund this and invest in it because the growers see the value.
So I mean, again, this is one of those you snooze, you lose things for our AgriTech innovators, in that anything you're thinking about doing, you're doing right now, you need to sort of find the next gear and put the pedal down. Because no one else on the other side of the world is waiting for us to come up with that solution, right? So
yeah, they're not. And the other thing they're doing there, which I'll touch on as well, is they're not just creating robots and arms to pick the fruit and the vegetables. They're actually also changing the genetics in the crops themselves to make it more accessible for the automated harvesting. So as an example, broccoli here in New Zealand, that grows within the bush, right? And that's quite difficult to automatically harvest unless you took the whole thing out. And so what they've developed here in North America, so Church Brothers, they actually have high-rise broccoli, so that the machine can just come straight through here and just chop off all the heads that you need, and they've actually changed the genetics of the broccoli itself. So that's the other aspect they're taking to this. They're actually changing genetics of crops so that it fits better with automatic harvesting.
which probably will feed quite well into, I know, other conversations you'll have in this webinar around GE and some of that side of it. Do you think, just another question, so there's obviously a cost to automation, and not everyone, especially robotics and things like that. In New Zealand, and this may not be a you question, but from your perspective, how do you see it being funded, particularly if there's a lot of farms here that won't be able to afford?
Yeah, and I think that goes to a global conversation, because if we're using New Zealand as a test market rather than just us, automatically harvesting our own crops, but it's going to be used in other countries, they can help with some of that. Cool. Because I know Western growers is looking beyond their own borders.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's where it goes back into those global connections. I don't think it's New Zealand needs to fund this to feed the world. It's New Zealand needs to have the incubation and the environment and ecosystem that we can develop these things for other countries who will invest in that.
Yeah. And were those new varieties using CRISPR?
Oh, good question. Most likely, because that's the most commonly used tool over in the States, the CRISPR tool.
Cool. I'd like to think it was my question, but it wasn't. It was one of the attendees. But thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. Okay, so then we move to Illinois and Saskatchewan. So this is also quite interesting, because this is where you've got your big arable farms, right? So what we were talking about before, the monocultures of your soybeans and your corn in Illinois, and in Saskatchewan, there's a lot of canola and wheat. That's mainly what's grown there. And what I've found talking to the farmers there is that their machinery has grown in size with the farms. So their properties keep growing bigger, and as they grow bigger, so does the machinery, only that stops at some point. Right, that can't continue into the unforeseen future, and they also have that to stay ahead and to even stay afloat, they have to grow as well. The farmers economically, so to stay economically afloat, they have to grow in size. I think the smallest you can be and still be economical is about 5,000 hectares. So that's a significant property, right? And the challenge that they have, though, is the operating of these big, machinery, the tractors and the sprayers and all that. So they still have to harvest. So it's still quite seasonal work. And you do have a lot of technology playing into this now, where you've got GPS and, your yield is monitored as you're collecting and harvesting the products. But people still need to drive the tractors and actually be there during harvest. So what they've done is they're taking retired farmers out of retirement during the harvest season, that they're the ones that actually drive the harvesters and, even the sprays right afterwards. So that was really interesting. But the challenge with that as well is that if the tech stops working, which it does on the tractors, so, it may not monitor the yield correctly, then those farmers, they don't know how to fix that. So they won't stop either to be like, okay, no, the yield's not monitoring it correctly. How do I fix that? So that's a challenge there, because they don't actually have a lot of accurate data then when it comes to the harvesting side. And there were more farmers that were talking about that. So technology is an interesting one, but then it also changes who you need on those machines to operate them, because they need to have a different skill set than what the traditional farmers have. So do we evolve our farming population and train them on how to use this? And how do we do that? This is more just to show the scale. In New Zealand, we have maybe one of these silos for wheat or corn or what we're growing down in Canterbury. But when we're in the US, Canada, they have 50 of these silos next to each other for one farm. It was just, you can't compare that scale. And what that actually really showed me is that New Zealand will never compete on scale. We have to stay at the premium end of the market. That's the only way for us to compete. Food security. So food security is another interesting one. This has grown in prominence as well based on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that's really starting to come to head now. And there's a lot of different groups looking at this. Now, the other aspect to this is also the growing food prices. That's also feeding into food security. So the way that America looks at it, North America, so they have in its traditional sense, so your farm security, and also they're looking at it from a national security lens. So with farm security, with the rise in prices and food affordability, that's actually creating a lot more theft on farms, and in California, particularly in the cannabis areas. So when it's time to harvest the crops, maybe 2 or 3 days before, you'll have the cartels come on and they'll harvest it for you. Or people will come and harvest, pistachios in the middle of the night. So now what you're seeing is a lot of these farms have to have really high security measures in place, and they hire ex-Navy SEALs and things like that as your security guards, because this is actually becoming a lot more of a lot bigger problem with the high value crops that are grown there. There's also the national security side. So this comes in two forms. So with the rise in technology and what we were talking about before with the GPS on tractors, right? That when you're planting your corn for the season, that it's all done by GPS mapping. Most farmers actually don't know how to plant it anymore themselves at the same, or at least it's not at the same rate as what you would get in GPS. So what happens during the 3-week period that you're planting when there's a cyber attack and your GPS is down? You would not have the same amount of yield for corn and for soybeans in that area. So that's actually something that the US is looking really closely into, the rise in cyber attacks and how susceptible some of their farming practices now are because of that rise in technology. So how do we deal with that and protect that? The other thing they're looking at is, this is where it gets really into the sci-fi area. So DARPA, which is the Defense Research Agency, so they are probably the most well-resourced agency in the US government. For those of you who have heard of them, you'll know they do a lot of the cool stuff, even the internet that was basically created by them. So what they're looking at is they have this project called Cornucopia. And so I met with the lead scientist on that. And what the intent of that is that it's on-demand production of food using microbiomes. So microbes, and they basically want to have these like little kits that you just add water, air, and electricity with the microbe, and that will then give you a nutritiously good food. And this is mainly used to research for the military area, because then when the military is out in the field, they don't have to carry all their food with them. They can just have a bar or a shake, that has all of the correct nutrients that they need in it. But yeah, they're actually looking at this as a much bigger thing of like resilience of the food system in North America, that every household, I mean, this is what they were talking to me about, that every household would have its own little, almost like a contraption on top of the washing machine that they could just put some microbes in, and then a couple of hours later they'd have some food for the household, which is just, that's the kind of level they're talking at, that you've got food production in the house, not just getting it from the land outside, but it's in your proximity.
I would hate for anyone to have to rely on my growing techniques, because I have to say I'm pretty shit. So I don't have a green thumb at all. I would definitely be needing technology to help me out there if I'm supposed to sustain myself.
Yeah, but yeah, look up Cornucopia if you haven't heard of it. So the Corn Belt. So the Corn Belt, why is that important? And what's the role of GE and GMO in global crops? And then what does that mean for gene editing here in New Zealand? So world corn production. So what we have is, because this is our biggest crop grown globally, and 32% of that is grown in the US. And then you've got 22% in China, Brazil, the rest of the world. Ukraine's quite big as well here for the 3%. They're more in the wheat space than in corn itself though. So 24% of global production, so 75% for America, that's all grown in the Corn Belt. The Corn Belt itself is basically across the I states here, so Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and a bit further north. It's seen as the most fertile soil on the planet. And that area, because the Corn Belt is heating up, that's actually starting to move further north now. Now, that's an important thing to know, because when you're going through there, it's about 50-50 corn and soybeans. And the reason that they do that is with corn, you need to put a lot of nitrates on it to have it grow. And then the next season you put on soybeans, and then that will pull the nitrate back out of the ground. So they're actually really good counter crops. So soybeans, they're actually used for, because that's all grown in the same area, 70% of that all goes to animal feed. you've only got about 15% that goes into the human food system directly. Now, animal feed still goes into the human food system indirectly, so it's 85% across the whole, and then you've got 5% in biodiesel and 10% in other. When it comes to corn, we've got 38% in animal feed, 10% is a food additive, and then we've got an exported amount there too. So that, let's say it's roughly 50%. There's also 30% here that's going into ethanol. Now that's a non-food product, right? So you're actually growing a lot of this corn to then go straight into biofuels instead of actually putting it into the food system. And the reason that is that in the US, it's mandated that 10% of the gas that's used in cars and, you know, trucks and that needs to be ethanol. So it's mandated by the government that you've basically got this biofuel, but it's actually an incredibly inefficient use of land, and especially when it's our most fertile soil on the planet. I mean, how many other things could we do with it?
Feed people, probably. Feeding people would be a good one.
This exported number is also a really interesting one to be looking at. So 16% of it's exported, and traditionally that went to countries like Mexico, it went to Colombia, I think Japan was also in there. China didn't feature on that list whatsoever. Since 2020, China's basically bought up all of it. So they have bought up all of that extra corn and the exported corn that the US has made. Now, the reason that they've done that is they're trying to rebuild their swine population, because with the swine flu, they basically had to decimate that, right? So they're rebuilding that. But on top of that, they're also trying to become self-sufficient in terms of their own food production. So they're getting back their pigs. What they did earlier or late last year was they also had approved in July, that actually put this through properly, that they could grow their own GM crops. And that wasn't used before. They were importing GE crops from, you know, the States and from other countries, but they weren't growing their own. So they've started growing their own now as well. And what that means is they're really going towards self-sufficiency. That's what we're seeing from them. Now, with that, according to the World Economic Forum, by 2100, their population will halve as well. They have a declining population right now. So they're expected to be from 1.4 billion going down to 800 million. Now, the rising populations are those African countries. So that's where you're going to have 1 billion extra. And the majority of that will actually be in Nigeria, interestingly enough. So what does that mean for our exports and where we're exporting food? Because China is not going to be a market for that much longer for us, unless we can keep that premium end and say that we're the best producers of food, right? That's the only way we can compete there. But we will never, you know, with their food security challenges and the way that they're really going to self-sufficiency. Now, that's also important to know, because these countries are big users of food, right? And so what does that mean for gene editing and GMO? Because in New Zealand, we need to start having this conversation. So this is from Te Puna Whakaranui, which is the primary sector think tank. So they have actually said in their report last year that we need to have this conversation. It's underway already in the EU and the UK and what it means for them. So we need to have it too, right? Because there are pros and cons to GE, but we need to have it all on the table and actually have a proper debate about what we want to do here, rather than kind of ignoring it. And there is a report coming out from Te Puna Whakaranui as well this quarter that is all on gene editing. So hopefully that might start some of that debate here in New Zealand, because it's important to have. Sorry, do you want to?
I was just going to say, I hope so as well, because I'm a little bit like you, and I don't think we've really had that conversation since, 10, 20 years ago, when, you know, all of a sudden, we didn't want anything in anyone, but times have certainly changed. And I mean, I remember someone saying to me that, you know, if you drink soy milk or almond milk or something, it's all based on GM crops or something, like, because it's all imported, you know, from someone else, a different country that is actually, you know, that's how they grow it. So it's not like it doesn't exist in New Zealand, but it'll be nice to have that conversation. And I mean, there's probably a whole nother webinar, which I'm sure would be, we'll try and figure that out as well. We can put that in.
Yeah, it is, because there's a lot of things that need to be put on the table for it, right? Because you've got the pros of you can have more resilient crops, which we need, especially with all of the weather events we're having, and they're not going away. We're seeing more extreme weather events in New Zealand, drier areas and wetter areas, like more wet days. So can we have seed and crops that can just handle that better? So you've got those aspects to it, but then you've also got, if we're at the premium market, can we still maintain that premium view if we're GE? Right. So
So
so there's a lot that plays into it. So it's not a simple conversation.
And I think the call to action there is to everyone who is listening, let's just have the conversation.
Yeah.
You know, because ignoring the conversation is probably not going to do anything either.
No, and it actually puts us at a disadvantage as well, because when a lot of the seeds that we use come from Bayer and Syngenta, right? They're the largest global seed producers in the world. And if they're putting a lot of investment into the GE crops, there's more and more going into that, right? And so if we want to be able to make use of that, right, and also try and use some of those crops, we need to be having the conversation at least first and seeing how far that goes. Because even if we had the conversation, it's not like this would happen tomorrow, right? This is a longer term thing. This is something that would take years to implement. And so the sooner we start talking about it, then the more resilient and prepared we will be. So really just on North America and Europe, what's the difference there? So I spent quite a bit of time in both of them. And what really came across actually with the two, with the countries I'd gone to and the states that I'd gone to, was that in North America, they're really proud still of farming. So they're proud of what they produce. They're proud of the quality. They look after their land, and they do try really hard. And they still have that, farmers that, they work with their father on the land and things like that in areas. So they're very proud. And they've shared that across America as well. So when you go to Washington, D.C., there's whole restaurant chains that basically showcase the food from that region. So it really has the provenance stories with it. And that's really important to them. So they're really proud of their background in farming and agriculture. In Europe, that's changing. So Europeans, particularly in the UK and the Netherlands, they're getting such pressure from the communities and from politicians. And with COVID, it meant that people couldn't go out for 2 years. So instead of being out in the land and, seeing how farming is, they've learned a lot of stuff and watched a lot of documentaries on Netflix and things like that. And I'm sure most of us have seen some of those documentaries as well that are quite one-sided. And they're basically now against farmers, is the perception I got. And those farmers, they're not proud anymore. They don't want to have their kids going into farming. They're looking at exit strategies and things like that. And it was quite sad to see. So it's just so for those that operate in those areas, you'll see that in a lot of places as well. But that food conversation is changing in Europe. So this is the last slide. So where do we need to play? So where do we need to focus? What's our future? So here in New Zealand, if we take it all back, it means like we've got a lot happening out there as well. So I think well-being and support for our farmers and our food producers is really important, particularly with all of the challenges that are happening at the moment. So we've got our water challenges, we've got our increasing adverse events, like that there is putting a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of stress out there. So there's a lot of well-being and support. And with GE, we need to start having the conversation. That would be my call to action from this as well. And for those of you that work in the tech space and, wanting to build new tech or automation and things like that, working globally. So if you're working at that global level, build those relationships and connections with other countries that you're trying to harness some of the benefits that they have as well. So the connections they have in those markets and some of the tech that they may have already. So that's really what I think our future is. But there's a lot happening out there. The world's changing quickly.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. All right. We have I've got some questions here. So if you want to buckle up, I'll just go through some of these. So do you see New Zealand farmers aligned? Oh, that's a good question. Do you see New Zealand farmers aligned with the North American pride farming or the European stressed farmers?
Oh, good question.
Yeah.
Hey, so I see both. Yeah, so it's a bit of both. Yeah. So we have, because in the UK, there's a big rise in activism there as well. So what I saw, and I spoke to a lot of farmers around this too, is that your environmental, your vegan, and your animal welfare groups have come together and they're sharing resources. So they're having really powerful impacts on the general population. And so we actually have that here in New Zealand as well. So there was a whole thing, in the middle of last year, which Aucklanders may remember, that we had this climate activist group that was going in Auckland and actually slashing people's tires that were driving utes, right? And that was a surprise to me. I didn't think that would come to New Zealand, but sure enough, it has. So we've got that. So we've got the European side, but I think we also still have the North American side where we are still proud of what we produce. And if we really do look at it, like, we're very efficient producers and we're good at what we do here in New Zealand. And that's, actually, I have to add to that actually needs to go into a global food story, because in the Netherlands, they, at the end of last year, they put out that they wanted to reduce their animal population by 30% for farming. So that's across chickens, pigs, and cows, dairy cows. And so they actually are really efficient at growing and producing the food that they do. The problem that they have is that they have no place for the ammonia and the nitrates that are coming from that farming system. And so they're actually taking an individual approach and saying, okay, well, do we need to be a net exporter then as a country? Maybe we should just feed our own population. But if every country goes down that route and says that, are we then also having massive production in, the desert areas, so Qatar and that, and that takes a lot more energy than it would if they were to buy food from the Netherlands and actually export some of the externalities that come with that as well. So I do think we need to have a global food conversation on what we want from food and where we grow, because here in New Zealand, we are efficient producers.
Yeah, I think sometimes I think also the story, we might need to ramp up the story for the general consumers around how their food is produced, because you'll often see people going, I want more sustainability and we need to stop this and stop this. But again, cause and effect. You stop one thing, it will impact another. So if people are happy to pay X, Y, Z more for their food, fine. But, I don't think we're there yet, that's for sure. Another question, what's your position regarding technology and data colonization from the major industry vendors, i.e. Syngenta, Bayer, John Deere? Can we avoid becoming hostages, as we are of the Microsofts, Googles, and Facebooks?
Oh, that's such a good question, because Bayer, they have oversight of 52% of the world's agriculture data because of all of the crops that they're involved in. So it's a really good question with those bigger corporates, and particularly when they sell the seed. They sell the sprays that go with it, the pesticides and the herbicides, and now they're selling the management tool of how you manage that crop. So what's the role of the farmer in that as well, right? The food producer, if everything's being prescripted for you on how to grow that. And I know that, because this actually goes on there too, Bayer, they recently in the US, they said, well, if you use this type of seed, right, we can guarantee the yield you'll get from that. And if the yield's slightly lower, Bayer will actually pay out the money that that farmer didn't get from getting that yield. But if it's higher, they have to share in the profits. So that got a lot of backlash from the farmers and the growers, but that's the kind of direction they're going to. So it's how do we not fall into that system? It's hard not to.
Yeah.
Look, to be honest, I think it's being aware of it.
That's what I was going to say. We're having the conversation, we're aware of things, so we're not going into things blind, and I think that's a good place to start. We have another question. What are the implications of what you saw for animal agriculture? Does automation vertical farms mean that animal ag will become a niche or sunset industry?
Good question as well. My personal view is that no, I think animals is not going to be a sunset or niche industry. I think it will end up in the premium space of anything. So we won't be able to afford to eat meat anymore, and so we'll have to go to other products. But I don't think it's going away. I mean, as humans, we've eaten meat since we were on the planet, right? So yeah, and there's still developing markets out there that want the same that we had.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm a meat eater, so I got no issues with that. When we were, another question here, when we were obviously discussing having a conversation around GE, do you have a view on how that should be framed and who should lead it?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Oh, I don't think I want to lead it, so I'll participate in it. It's a joint effort. So we all need to be part of the conversation. Who leads it though? Because
well, we can throw that out to anyone watching.
Yeah,
if anyone wants to lead that conversation, then we're happy to sort of join you.
Yeah, the science sector I think would be really well placed to lead it, because then you can put the science behind it, and then making sure that it is I would almost say the science to have the correct data and to have trust and reliable data around it.
Because I think especially in New Zealand, we have a lot of emotive feelings that we would need to get past, and I think the science and the research would certainly go a long way to
because it needs to be done independently.
And probably the last question before we wrap up, so this one's my question to you. Do you think New Zealand could survive the zombie apocalypse, aka are we self-sufficient?
No. This comes back to some of the work I do in my day job as well, because there's a misconception that because we produce so much food and we export it, that we are self-sufficient, but we're not, because to produce that food, we rely on imports and critical inputs from overseas to do that. So if we stopped getting fuel tomorrow, for example, nothing would get grown, right? And so that's the same with your fertilizers and, some of the animal feed that we rely on as well. We can reduce some of that, but we just wouldn't get the right nutrients if we turned everything off, right? But we relied on too much of the input. So we're not self-sufficient.
I mean, I think in the first wave of the zombies, at least we would know we would have a lot of radish and carrot seeds. As I discovered the other day, we grow the largest proportion of carrot seeds and radishes in the world, so we'll be able to see in the dark or something, that's for sure. But look, on that note, I want to sincerely thank you. I mean, we seriously, anyone who's watching this, we squeezed down what is originally a 3-hour presentation, 2 to 3 hours worth of information into this rapid fire 1 hour. And if we get a chance, we will beg Lucie to come back for a round 2 on anything that we missed. Having said that, I know, Lucie, there's a report that is coming out shortly on some of your findings, and also you've got that second round of trips to do. So maybe we'll catch up with you after you come back from that second round and see what other insights you have to share.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Awesome. Thank you everyone for watching.
Awesome. And so, thank you everyone who joined us. If you haven't already, please register for our roadshow tour that AgriTech NZ is taking on next month. We would love to see you in person. You can come and hear about what's going on with the industry transformation plan and some of the awesome milestones and achievements that we've done in the last 2 years, all of these businesses in New Zealand. So thank you from myself and from Lucie and everyone else. Have a good day.